Hey friends, welcome to another episode of Sketchy Ideas, the live point-counterpoint video podcast where we illustrate the big concepts surrounding business, leadership, personal development, movies, you name it. We talk about it and we have a little fun along the way while we think twice about exploring that new idea we just discovered on the internet. Hi, I'm Brad James.
And I'm Michael Rampola.
And we are your hosts, and today we are going to help you determine if you are good, if you are bad, or if you are ugly. And that live, magical world of understanding how we get there. But before we dive in, a word from our sponsors. So today's episodes are, as well as always, sponsored by and powered by Cream City Marketing, a small, medium-sized, full-service marketing company where we help businesses figure out how to plan, strategize, and implement a marketing strategy that will help them drive revenue, not just follow those vanity metrics that everybody talks about. And our next sponsor
is Spirity. Overcome your obstacles. We work with business owners to help them grow and scale their businesses, and we work with HR leaders to help them grow and scale their talent. It's not for lack of goals and not for lack of effort that you're not getting those great things accomplished. It's more often than not just for a lack of a plan and the discipline to follow it. That's where we can help you, is coming up with a great segmented plan to achieve those goals, monitor the right things along the way, and enable you to achieve that next level of success. Spirity.
And that pulls us right back here to episode 25. We've been doing this 25 times. That's almost half a year. So if you've been following us since the beginning, that's 6 months worth of episodes. And for those of you who don't know, the whole premise of why we're diving into the good, the bad, the ugly, and which one you are, is because it is the new year. And Michael and I talked a lot about it with a lot of his clients and a lot of the people he works with, beginning to dive into this magical world of personality assessments. If you haven't taken one, you probably have. You just don't know.
Have you been living under a rock, or have you been off the grid? Because I don't think you can go on a social media site or even the internet in general and not bump into, which flower are you? Which Disney princess should you be? I don't even know, right? What color are you? What
Star Wars character are you?
Star Wars character are you? What color should your socks be? I don't even know. I mean, there's a dozen 20 every day.
That's right. Especially if you're a big fan of BuzzFeed, you've probably taken these a number of times. So today we wanted to dive into this whole world because if we think about the ones that we hear about most specifically in business or leadership or career development, we hear about Myers-Briggs, we hear about DISC, we hear about Colby, we hear about which personality type are you? Are you sanguine? Are you melancholy? Are you choleric? And what's the last one? I'm drawing a blank on the last one.
Sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic.
Phlegmatic, yes. So you raise the flag.
Based on the humors. That's
right.
Yeah, wow. Yep.
So when you think about this, the reason, the history of how this whole thing came out is because we as human beings need to classify and characterize as many things as we can. It's like built into our DNA. It's why we have nomenclature systems. It's why we build taxonomies across all the living branches of life on the planet. It's why we decide to dive in and label things even if they're not labeled. It's why historians are so gung-ho and archaeologists are so gung-ho about tying buildings and finds to a name rather than just calling it a thing. It's how marketing and sales works, right? When you can actually label and put a name on something, it's way easier to sell because it's tangible. Mm-hmm. Basically, if we classify things, we're giving them a name, and we as human beings need to name stuff, right? I am Brad. I have a name.
Well, and it's interesting because that right there. Well, okay, so let's take a minute. What is the value? What is the value of nomenclature, taxonomy, categorization? Right? Functionally speaking, it just makes it easier to know what we're talking about. Like, as a basic level of communication, it helps to be able to classify things, to classify you as Brad and give you an identity that is whole and separate from the identity of Michael, which, by the way, nobody else should want, just for the record. I've claimed it, and you're welcome. The idea of the categorization, right, helps us also assess and evaluate new and different things as how they compare to things we're already familiar with. So there's value in categorization there. So there is, I mean, so personality tests have some good traits.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, it's all tied to survival. I mean, that's why when we see pictures in clouds, they found the reason we see pictures in clouds is because your brain has to classify something and name it, because it essentially creates the fight or flight response in your brain. So you see that one cloud, it looks like a tiger. The reason that is because 1 out of 10 times when you've seen a tiger in wilderness, it struck you and you knew you needed to run. That's why our brain finds images, because we need to be able to classify that stuff. So this is all biological, like deep science stuff. But I don't want to dive into that stuff. I want to talk about, Michael, you had an interesting take on one of those assessments that comes up all the time with your clients. Do you want to share a story maybe about how this came to be and how like you began to dive into this stuff yourself?
Yeah, you know what? It's I'm not going to call it. Well, we'll come back to it. It's the DISC. DISC is to personality assessments as Zoom is to video conferencing. DISC is the de facto shorthand for personality tests, especially at work, for good reason. For good reason. It does a great job of categorization. It's a self-assessment, and when people take self-assessments and they look at the results, they tend to find a lot of truth there. I hope they do. If it's designed well, they should. My biggest thing is, and I literally just got this call yesterday. Somebody saying, "Hey, I know the work that you do. We're thinking we'd like to do a DISC assessment and kind of see where everybody's at." And it reminded me of my old training consultant days inside bigger companies, and they would say, "Hey, I think my people need training," and the default response is, "Let me grab my bag. I'm on my way." But that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. If I give you a DISC assessment and what you need is not the result of a DISC assessment, then it's not going to solve your problem. It might make you feel better for a while. So I feel like the DISC assessment and a lot of personality tests in general kind of become a salve or a balm for what ails us. If we can better understand ourselves and understand the people we work with, that should solve all of our problems. Right? Oh, Brad, you're off.
We talk about using these assessments as a way to build teams, right? So within the framework that when we get called in, right, we look at leadership and then we look at team. And if the team doesn't fit around the leader, either because of personality or skill set, how do you grow, right? Because if there's no chemistry, just because everybody is in the DISC world, right, a dominant personality, nothing gets done, right? So those things, there's a place for them, right? They are still good, but I think your problem, the way you were telling me, is that people believe it as gospel, right? Like it is the only thing that we should believe in. Tell me if I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. So personality tests can be, as Brad pointed out, they can be a survival tool. I like that. Personality tests as team builder, sure. There's value in a personality test as a way for us to build and understand how our team works together. My challenge is that when the personality test becomes, I'm going to see if I can draw one. Yeah, that's decent. Becomes a crutch, or it becomes a box. And the kind of box that I put myself in or I put somebody else in because I need to simplify who they are. And I want to put them in the box and leave them there. And that's the biggest challenge that I see. And for whatever reason, probably because of its ubiquity, DISC seems to be the one that people use as crutch and box more often than not. Well, it's because I'm a D. Well, you need to work with them differently because they're an S, or it's either because I am A or because you are A. That either justifies or explains or dismisses some potentially bad behaviors.
Right. Yep. I mean, and there's other ones out there. It looks like some of the comments we got. So Susie said, "Hey, have you tried the endotype, for example?" and Consuela identified what you said earlier is like, hey, we're about using the same language, and it does. Like, again, we're not bashing these things, but the premise is that so many people and so many leaders or consultants who come in look at it and go, hey, this is the end all be all. How do you follow it, right? Like, for example, one we use is called the Kolbe test. And if you're not familiar with the Kolbe Institute, they work on your cognitive mind, not your cognitive mind. Two different types of thinking. Cognitive is voice of God, how do you spell cognitive versus cognitive? Cognitive makes sense. Cognitive, though, is how your mind works when it's at work. So there's very much a difference of how your brain works when you're working versus when you're at rest. You know, and Myers-Briggs, I don't know, do people still use the Myers-Briggs these days?
Well, what's interesting, the Myers-Briggs is still used because the Myers-Briggs is the original 4-box, if you remember, right?
Mm-hmm.
Myers-Briggs, and it's actually 8 because there's 4 divisions within each. But Myers-Briggs goes back to, it's your 4 humors. It actually, it goes all the way back. I mean, it was one of the originals, Aristotle, Socrates, one of those guys that proposed these ideas in the first place. And people still use it, but more often than not, they just give it new fancy names. It's the true colors test, or all of the examples, the jokes we were pulling up earlier. Which Star Wars character are you? They're based on the exact same idea, and it's because, in a good way, these are tropes, and I use tropes as a positive term here, in the sense that these are types of characters that are used to make up teams or to make up scripts of well-known works of entertainment art. And therefore, they work well because more often than not, for a good group dynamic, you need all of them, and all of them work together to create interesting dynamics. So do people still use Myers-Briggs? Sure. Old school folks, know their 4-letter definitions. New school folks say, well, I'm most like, Yoda or something. I don't know. I mean, insert pop culture framework here.
Harry Potter character.
Harry Potter. Thank you. Well, Harry Potter, was it 4 different? I'm obviously not a Potter person. Do you think those 4 things might be the same 4 categories?
Are you a Gryffindor, a Hufflepuff, a Ravenclaw, or a Slytherin?
And I guarantee you that those 4 things easily map to those same 4 corners. And whether J.K. Rowling meant it or not, it's a natural way to categorize people because of the 2 dimensions, right? Introvert, extrovert, and it's outcomes or inputs. And which one of those 4, which way you tend on those 2 dynamics, tends to help explain how you interact with the world. Back to the cognitive, cognitive. Cognitive is how you understand the world. Cognitive, it sounds like, is how you work with it. And they can be similar, but they can be different. Is that right? Those are 2 different dynamics?
Yeah. It's how you think about the world. And during those times. I'm not the brain guy. I'm the chemist, biology guy. Michael's the psychology dude.
There's my brain and my gear, how I think, how I work. So I think when things get ugly, I'm going to check it off. When things get ugly is when these tests get misused or overused or oversimplified, or they're taken as be all end all and all time. And I guess that's another thing here where it's a forever thing. I will always be a Gryffindor. I am a Gryffindor. I was born a Gryffindor. I will always be a Gryffindor. Okay. And
people don't change.
Right. Really?
Yeah.
So talk about that. I think we can do a callback to another episode on that one. Here's the thing about it. If you believe that people never change, then you can use something like a disc profile and be just fine. I don't know that you're being accurate, but if that's what you believe, then these tests often reinforce those beliefs. And they're presented in that way. And if you're familiar with the idea of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, those mindsets can be triggered or encouraged by how you present information. And I've seen DISC misrepresented as forever instead of point in time. And when that happens is when I see these that's when I think personality tests get ugly, because if I say, well, I'm a D and I'll never be any different or I'll never be any better, right? That's not accounting for the opportunity to grow and get better. And I think mentally that can be really limiting.
Well, you talked about it being a crutch last night when we were talking about this.
Yep.
I mean, you said the thing about personality tests is that once people have been defined, they go, well, that's what I am. And so this is what leads into like what you do, right?
Right.
All of the clients that you work with that have these tools, they're great tools, right? It gives you a baseline measurement. But often that's all the further they take it is they go, this is what it is, this is how it works, rather than going, hey, looks like there's some weaknesses here. What things can we do to help this individual grow in this area so that they can work better with other people over here who have complementary skill sets? So
Yes.
like we get to a point where we've overanalyzed and overplanned all of this stuff by going, there's a single point and there's only a single point, right? Like if it's literally, if this is growth, right? It's literally going, oh, we've measured it, they've plateaued. And that's all they will ever be, right?
Right.
And when in fact, it could be like this, right? If you really think about it, people are moving up consistently, but they got to be willing to do it. Whereas if they're just staying flat, of course you're going to wonder why they're never developing. It's the whole premise. And this typically, when I work with people, I go, look, it starts with leadership, always. If leadership doesn't look at this stuff as a tool to work off of as a baseline measurement, these are all just measurement tools. That's it in my book. And you can dissect them to a T, but the idea with every single personality test needs to be, hey, great, do we look at it now and then never look at it again? Or do we look at it now and then bump it up, like, and look at it later and then look at it 6 months from now? So the companies that I've seen use these things successfully do it at annual report times, or if they're sending somebody through like a training regimen, or when they move somebody from department to department, how does that change throughout after working in every department? Or all of those different things. Consuela says, hey, but do they change in what they would need to be qualified? Do I think an introvert will become an extrovert, or should they put effort into making that change?
Ooh.
Thank you for the question. That's an awesome question.
Nice.
I will say this, nobody is completely an introvert and nobody is completely an extrovert. It's all based on situational dynamics and who they're around. And I think those are skill sets that people can work on if they feel it will impact where they want to get to. That's the way I approach that debate.
Yeah, I think that's great. And let me pick that up. And Consuela, thanks for engaging. I think each of these is a scale and a spectrum. And it's important. It's not an either or. I'm not an introvert or an extrovert. I'm somewhere on said scale. I am not only focused on outcome or only focused on input. I am somewhere on that scale. And I think a lot of these things fall into that world, which is why, again, people locking into a corner of a 4-box and never leaving and not understanding that they can, in certain situations, shift and mold and move. The other thing I want to pull in is, you talked about it all in context and environmental inputs. We have, as humans, we have 2 sets of needs, personal and interpersonal. If I'm not around other people, my personal needs rule. But as soon as I start interacting with others, my interpersonal needs need to be met. And the same thing goes for my behaviors and my personality. If I am on my own, my set of behaviors is one thing. But as soon as I start interacting with a world and interacting with other people who also have their own styles, whether I realize it or not, I'm going to make adjustments because I'm influenced by those forces. It's physics, ultimately. So that's why I think when these tests and assessments are good is when they're put in context, which is what Brad was, I think, starting to point to. And if you're intentional about how they're applied and the frequency with which they are reevaluated, again, you can get good value out of it. And the other question is, to what end are we knowing this? So to Consuela's question, if I am very I'm not going to say all right? If I'm very introverted, is that going to be a barrier to me being successful in my life? Then I might need to look at some specific extroverted behaviors that are going to enable me to better operate in the world and achieve success, or at least eliminate or minimize the impact of those derailers. in a sense, and I know Consuela's a certified strengths coach, and strengths is another one that I meant to mention earlier. I think strengths are great because they're your natural inborn talents, but they're talent to start. They become strengths when you understand them and work to make them better and get greater understanding of when and how to best apply them. And there's a whole bunch of other things, right, that could be your barriers, and you can use one against the other, or in many cases, your strengths can also be your biggest crutch because they can be overused. Personality tests can also be overused. Like all of these things are operating in that same thing where I love I love and hate the blanket answer of it depends. But it's true that it does depend. It depends on the context, and it depends on to what purpose. I know. Well, son, shut up. Here's the two biggest things it depends on. It depends on the context in which it's operating, what's the current state, and it depends on the goal of the outcome. To what end are we doing this? Because that right there would tell you in a lot of cases, if you're going to do a personality assessment or a team dynamic assessment, I love assessments. I love data. What you're trying to figure out and how you plan to use that data should inform which assessment and which data you gather. And that's where I think DISC as the blanket be all end all. Okay, I'm going to say it. I'm going to put it out there. And I know I'm literally like poking the tiger with some people I know on this one. DISC is dead. It should be dead anyway, because I'm saying it. DISC is dead. DISC is dead. Here's why. Because it's been used and abused, and it's not its fault, right? But we tend to, in our desire and need to categorize and understand the world, we oversimplify and overuse, and therefore, I don't think DISC is a bad assessment. I think when it gets used badly is one of the things that makes me struggle with that assessment.
Wow. So all right. Before we start, like seeing all your colleagues and peers out there,
I'm getting downvoted and unliked and unfollowed left, right, and center.
Exactly.
I'm okay with that.
All right. Before we do that, we said this whole topic was going to need a couple of episodes.
Oh yeah.
And since we're coming up on the 30 minutes that we're trying to work on this year, that's one of our goals.
One of our goals.
We talked about, what are some things that people can do prior to maybe leveraging one of these assessments to make sure they're using it the right way. And I don't want to give away too many secrets on it, but next week, we're actually going to dive into an assessment that Spirity uses to see if people are actually ready to grow or not, and how that works within the context of all of these personality assessments. Now, again, they're assessments, and they work when leveraged within the context of why you're doing it. So I would be interested at some point, hey, Consuela, if you want to hop on with us next week, I would be very excited to hear your take on what we talked about today before we even get into some of those details. Or maybe a couple weeks from now, let's hear about what the strengths assessment does in the context between skills versus, say, mental soft skills, right? Hard skills versus soft skills is always something that we talk about. Or like in the Kolbe test, it's subsets of combining soft skills and hard skills in order to make sure things are done correctly. That type of stuff. I really think this is a cool realm, and I think this whole area is always going to improve, right? With artificial intelligence getting better and more data being pulled in. I think all of the assessments we see today, conjecture-wise, 20 years from now are going to look way different. Essentially, we're going to have consistent readouts. Those Pentagon charts, right? Where it's this star thing, and this is going to be something that follows us around all the time, and you're going to have an opportunity to work on it. But if you don't, you end up just becoming stale. Like this will be something that follows us forever, just like a rating system does with Uber or that type of stuff. Just because. So
am I going to have a star rating floating over my head all the time now? People are just going to know.
Hey, we're getting there. I mean, especially now because it's all digital.
Yeah.
Like we're almost there. So this is a whole thing where when we look at the idea of assessments and personal assessments. Remember, just because you're labeled that way doesn't mean you are that way forever. You can change it if you put in the time and the work. But often the challenge to that is people go into those assessments with the incorrect mindset of once I'm labeled, rather than the mindset of once I hear the information, what do I do with the information to grow as an individual? And I think that is a part that next week when we talk about this, you'll get some different ideas on how to approach these. And maybe if you're leveraging these assessments in your organization, you'll be able to find some interesting ways to get better buy-in, not only for that one-time thing, but also look at it from a standpoint of, hey, we're going to do it this once, then we're going to do it 3 months or 6 months from now we're going to do it a year from now. And you'll begin to build, not only will you build rapport with the client, but you'll also begin to see measurable results in the frameworks and the tools you're implementing inside of that organization.
You're absolutely right. It goes back to the earlier point, which was in context. To what end? Understanding the value of this data and what having that data can do for you makes these tools powerful and useful and not dangerous. And it's like it's a hammer, right? If this falls under this heading. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If all I know is disk, and I know how to label people under disk, then that's how my whole worldview becomes based on that. Now, I do know somebody who, again, I was poking earlier, who is actually really good at disk, and he can literally like size somebody up in a conversation, but it's not an end point. And I think that's one of the biggest things I want everybody to take away from today, and what we want to pick up again next week. Assessments are starting points, not ending points. Assessments are starting points, not ending points. And the other thing I want to pull in, I'm going to stay with me for 1 second on this. When back in my early management days, and we got training about how to work with people with disabilities, one of the key points of that training was this is a person with a disability, not a disabled person. It's a subtle nuance of language, but I think it's important. It's a label. And it's the point Brad was making. I'm going to go way back and go past that and go all the way back to middle school, where I learned this one. Labeled jars, not people. And I think all of this goes to that same point, which is there is value in understanding and categorizing the world as a way for you to better interact with it, as long as you understand that just like you are ever changing and ever dynamic, so is the world and the people around you. So assessments and their results are starting points for whatever goals you want to accomplish next. And that's what we're going to pick up next week when we look at some different kinds of assessments that are all focused on growth and improvement.
I like it. Cool. Hey, so with that, we're gonna hop off here until next week. But I do want to say thank you for all of the involvement today. We had Sarah, Consuela, Susie, everybody who is responding. Thank you very much. It makes the show way better and actually helps us figure out what more we can talk about. Consuela, we're definitely going to be in touch because we want you on to talk about what you do. If you do want to be a part of the show, message us, get in touch with us either on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, or email us at info@sketchyideashow.com, and one of us will be in touch. But hey, it's 2021. We're trying to put together tools and information and bring on some interesting guests that will help you make 2021 10 times the year that 2020 was, regardless of if you had a good year or a rough year, okay? Because no more sketchy years, no more of that junk. I'd say a different word, but this is a family-friendly show. So with that,
no more sketchy years, just sketchy ideas.
That's right, just sketchy ideas. With that, thank you for watching this episode of Sketchy Ideas, where we take the time to dive into some of those sketchy ideas we find on the internet, but make sure that just because it's sketchy doesn't mean it's not worth exploring. Thanks again. I'm Brad James. See you next week.
I'm Michael Rampol. We'll see you next time.